Senator Canavan.
Thank you, Mr Deputy President. You can tell that the Greens don't have a lot of experience running businesses because their prescription for job creation and greater economic activity is to find the most expensive way of doing something, and that will create more jobs, because it's not in dispute that renewable energy is more expensive. Indeed, Senator Millen in her contribution admitted that. She admitted that when she said that by exempting the aluminium industry, we're going to increase the power bills of consumers around the country. So renewable energy is a more expensive form of energy, and according to the Greens and Senator Millen, by doing more expensive things or doing the same thing in a more expensive way, we'll somehow have a stronger economy. It's not a prescription that would be commonly formulated. It's certainly not one that they would put in that context. But sometimes in this place, Mr Deputy President, we make things so complex when they should be much more simple, because while this is a complex piece of legislation, it's actually got a very simple prescription at its heart, because the renewable energy target mandates that the producers of cheap electricity in our country must buy each year a set amount of expensive electricity. The simple truth underlying this legislation is that renewable energy is expensive energy. If it were not expensive, then the renewable energy sector would not need this legislation. We do not have a shortage of cheap electricity in Australia. We have ample resources of coal and gas, and traditionally that has meant we have some of the cheapest power prices in the world. Cheap power means dear wages, because cheap power helps improve productivity and provides businesses with the ability to invest in more capital and more highly skilled workers. But renewable energy is somewhere between double and 5 times the cost of our fossil-based resources. We sometimes hear that solar is now competitive with fossil fuel-based electricity, to which I respond, good. We can remove all of the subsidies we currently have to support renewable industries if that is the case. But of course they do not want that. As the Productivity Commission stated about the renewable energy target in 2011, the Commission has assumed that the long-run marginal cost of wind power is $110 per megawatt hour. This is based on data from Frontier Economics that suggested the long-run marginal cost of wind power projects in Australia was mostly in the range of $100 to $120 per megawatt hour. The average wholesale price of electricity in Australia is $50 per megawatt hour. This implies that for wind power projects to meet their long-run marginal cost, the renewable electricity certificate price would need to be around $60 Australian dollars. At that price, now that's hard for people to visualise, but let's try to in something a bit more tangible. Because at that price, if you have a 3.5 megawatt capacity wind turbine, that could potentially produce around 30,000 megawatt hours a year, because you times that by 24 and times it by 365, that gives you the potential megawatt hours that that turbine could produce a year, around 30,000. In fact, most wind turbines in Australia only produce power 30% of the time, so it would only produce just over 9,000 megawatt hours a year. If the REC price has to be $60 a megawatt hour to produce this electricity, that means that that wind turbine gets $551,000 from other energy consumers. So when you drive past a wind turbine on your travels next time, just remember that each one of those turbines is getting something like $500,000 courtesy of other energy users and customers in this country every year just to operate. And the average life of a turbine is around 20 years, so that means that they're getting around $10 million over their lifetime. $10 million, courtesy of other power users. Just one turbine, just one of them. And we're told that we're going to have to install more than 1,000 of these things to meet this target that we're going to legislate here. Some argue, though, that the renewable energy target will deliver cheaper energy over time. That last bit is important. They say cheaper electricity over time. Not now, but over time. Whether or not that will actually happen, of course, is a gamble. It's a risk. There is no guarantee in our legislation that it will become cheaper. Those that argue that this legislation is good for the economy are effectively taking one big punt, that some forms of renewable energy will come down like manna from heaven in the future and be cheaper. That is a huge risk to take with our economy, and we have seen this play out before, and it ended in tragedy then too. For a long time, people in Australia argued that we should have high tariffs on cars, clothing and white goods to help protect local industries, and that over time those industries would become more competitive and we could remove the tariffs. Well, that never happened, and I fear the same result will occur with our renewable energy industry if we maintain a high renewable energy target as we have had. Worse, at least high tariffs did protect jobs in labour-intensive industries like manufacturing. But renewable energy is not a particularly labour-intensive form of energy provision. Much of the construction of the turbines occurs overseas, and once the turbines are installed, there are very few people to work out around the turbines. Indeed, some of the management of the turbines that exist in Australia actually occur overseas in the home country of their design. So if this legislation is not to create jobs, what is it for? Well, one of the objects of the Act, of the Renewable Electricity Act, is to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases in the electricity sector. However, renewable energy is a particularly costly way of doing that. According to the Productivity Commission, the implicit abatement cost of the large-scale renewable energy target is between $37 and $111 per tonne. This is a much higher price than the less than $15 per tonne that was recently achieved through the Coalition's direct action policy. The Productivity Commission's estimate also assumes that renewable energy has no emissions itself, which is not correct given that wind turbines, for example, are made of steel and need enormous amounts of concrete to hold them in place. And some estimates say that each megawatt of wind power produced takes around 460 tonnes of steel. Each megawatt of wind power also takes around 870 cubic metres of concrete. Now let's compare that to something else, to natural gas. Natural gas takes 27 cubic metres of concrete for each megawatt of power and 3.3 tonnes of steel for each megawatt. I wonder which one is more environmentally sustainable and friendly. The renewable energy target gets less bang for more buck. That's why I think it's a good thing that this bill reduces the target and exempts more industries from having to purchase renewable energy certificates. This new law will ensure Australia's emissions-intensive trade-exposed industries will be fully exempt from the increased costs imposed by the renewable energy target. These costs are imposed on industries like the aluminium industry in central Queensland. There are 2 major aluminium refiners near Gladstone that employ almost 2,000 people. And when Senator Milne talks about jobs and the aluminium industry, she might want to reflect on the 2,000 people in central Queensland that rely on their full-time jobs on cheap power. And if we remove cheap power, they will no longer have a job. And central Queensland is already doing it tough after a slowdown in the coal mining sector. It doesn't need the double whammy of pressure on its aluminium industry too. So I welcome that this legislation will remove this sword of Damocles that has been hanging over the head of the Gladstone economy. I have been fortunate enough to attend 5 hearings of the Senate Select Committee on Wind Turbines, and of course I won't preempt the report of or the findings of that committee here today. But I have been to some of these people's homes. I have heard their genuine concerns about the impact of wind turbines. These people are normal, everyday Australians. And I don't know if Senator Milne's actually gone and spoken to some of these people before she dismisses their concerns as ludicrous, but I think she probably should have an obligation to do that. Because when you go and talk to these people, people like Ricky Nicholson from Cape Bridgewater, he's had to move his home. He and his wife have moved out of their home because of the impact of turbines. Mr David Mortimer from Lake Bonnie in South Australia, his wife has suffered so much he sold his farm so he could live further away from the wind turbines. Mr Ron Gelbart, east of MacArthur Wind Farm, has badly disrupted sleep, and his son also suffers similar complaints and also from tinnitus as well when he visits their farm. The stories go on and on. Last week we had a couple, Miss Clive and Trina Gare, who are actually hosts of wind turbines. They've been paid around $1 million from the wind turbine industry, but they say they would never have them again, given the problems it has caused them, particularly in terms of their sleeping. I do not know that if wind turbines have caused these complaints. I'm not a medical professional, but it does seem coincidental that there are so many people willing to go to so far and great a financial cost to move their own home and disrupt their own lives because of the impact they feel has been felt by wind turbines. I certainly believe that there are legitimate questions, particularly around the impact of infrasound and low-frequency noise that is generated by wind turbines. What has concerned me more, though, than the concerns of the community is the dismissive and contemptuous attitude of some in the wind industry. Multiple wind turbine operators have said to the committee that because they comply with all regulations, they have no further obligations to the residents that claim to be affected. That is not true. Under the long-established tort of negligence, persons engaged in supplying goods and services have a duty of care to take reasonable actions to prevent foreseeable damage occurring. Some in the wind industry are not being reasonable. A representative from one wind company tabled a cartoon belittling the complaints of affected residents to the Senate committee. A cartoon. Another wind industry staffer has tweeted that those complaining are nutters. This is not the behaviour of an industry that is taking their responsibilities to the wider community seriously. So given that the wind industry doesn't seem to be serious about taking their obligations into account, we should be. We should not be giving each wind turbine $500,000 a year through this legislation without then making sure that they are not doing harm to people and causing adverse health impacts. So while the wind industry doesn't seem to believe that it has an obligation to do no harm, I think we do. And until we know more about the impact of wind turbines, and in particular the impact of infrasound and low-frequency noise, we should have a moratorium on the accreditation of new wind turbines under this Act. Under Division 3 of this Act, the regulator has the power to accredit new wind turbine operators. That should not occur until we understand the full impact of these things, because should be on our watch that we make sure we don't do harm to people, and we must do more research into this before we go down the path of funding through enormous amounts of government subsidies or legislation that imposes subsidies that potentially cause harm.